I now have the pleasure to introduce Alex Matheson from the LGBT Foundation to explore the history of NHS Rainbow Badges and discuss LGBTQ+ inclusion in healthcare. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks for that, Steve. Yes, I'm here to talk to you about the NHS Rainbow Badges scheme and more about LGBT inclusion in healthcare. Just so everyone knows, my pronouns are she and her, and that will become evident why I'm saying that later on. So, starting with a timeline of the history of healthcare and helping you to understand some of the historical issues which have created some healthcare barriers for LGBT people. If you look at the left-hand side, you'll see we start in 1967, and this is when England decriminalised homosexuality between two men. And this was specifically between two men over the age of 21. Moving to 1980, this was when aversion therapy stopped being offered by the NHS as a cure for homosexuality. Aversion therapy was predominantly conducted using electric shock treatment. Patients would be shown images of both men and women in various states of undress, and electric shocks would be administered when they were looking at images of the same sex. The aim being to increase the amount of time that they looked at members of the opposite sex and avoid the shocks. Another method that was commonly used was to administer apomorphine, and this would induce nausea and vomiting, and patients would be expected to watch videos or look at pictures of homosexual activity whilst experiencing those effects. Understandably, this was not a pleasant treatment, and so it's with quite some celebration that it was stopped. Also in the 1980s, we had the first cases recorded of what was initially called gay-related immune deficiency. That's what we now know as AIDS, but it was also commonly called gay cancer at the time. Obviously, the name changed once it became evident that other groups were susceptible. In 1992, the World Health Organization stopped listing homosexuality as a mental illness, and in 2004, the British government enacted the Gender Recognition Act. You might have seen recently there's been some news about overhauling this, but at the time it was quite an amazing piece of legislation. And it was the first thing that allowed transgender people to gain a gender recognition certificate, which would give them the availability to change their original gender marker on the birth certificate. One of the key issues around the GRC process was that it did allow for spousal veto, and that's still the same to this day. In 2007, the Department of Health produced the first LGBT briefings, and this demonstrated their commitment to addressing the needs of LGBT people and starting to look at what the barriers were and how to overcome them. In 2010, we had the Equality Act, which was the first to provide protection against discrimination for a number of protected characteristics, and it included within that sexual orientation and gender reassignment. And it wasn't until 2018 that the World Health Organization stopped listing trans identities as mental illnesses. So quite some time after they stopped listing homosexuality as a mental illness. So moving to more current times and the situation for LGBT people as it stands, the following statistics have all been taken from reports and studies that were conducted in the past 5 years. So 23% of LGBT people have at one time witnessed anti-LGBT remarks by healthcare staff. 45% of trans young people aged between 11 and 19 years, and 22% of cisgender, lesbian, gay and bisexual young people have tried to take their own life at some point. Among the general population, the NHS estimates that this figure is around 13% for girls and 5% for boys in the age group 16 to 24. 24% of homeless people aged 16 to 24 are LGBT. This statistic is obviously far greater than the expected number of LGBT people in the general population. Of these young people, many of them feel the reasons for their homelessness is directly related or caused by them identifying as a member of the LGBT communities, and often they're directly thrown out by their parents as a result of coming out or being outed. As we know, being homeless has massive impacts for long-term health outcomes for people and creates a physical barrier to accessing care. 52% of LGBT people reported experiencing depression in the previous year, and this includes 67% of trans people and 70% of non-binary people. Non-binary people are those who don't identify as simply male or female. They may identify as both at the same time, neither male or female, or they may feel more fluid. Often they refer to their gender identity as falling on a spectrum. Next slide, please. 40% of trans people who accessed or tried to access public healthcare services reported having experienced at least one negative encounter because of their gender identity in the previous 12 months. 93% of LGBT specialists working in healthcare and service users consider that more work needs to be done to improve end-of-life services for LGBT people. This is especially important if you consider the age range of those often accessing end-of-life services, and they will have been the ones that have potentially been around during times when their identities were criminalised or treated in a pathological manner. 19% of trans people noted that when accessing healthcare, their specific needs were ignored or not taken into account, and 16% of these experienced inappropriate curiosity from healthcare professionals. When we talk about inappropriate curiosity, that's where healthcare professionals are asking questions directly related to their transition or their genitalia, and neither of those questions are relevant to their presenting healthcare need at the time. Another thing that may be a factor in inappropriate curiosity is expecting the trans person to act as a teaching aid for other professionals. And lastly, 37% of LGB women have incorrectly been told by a health professional that they do not require to get cervical screening done because of their sexual orientation. Next slide. So, looking at the NHS Rainbow Badges now, Phase 1 of the NHS Rainbow Badge scheme was developed and led from Evelina London Children's Hospital, which is part of Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation Trust, and it was created by Dr. Michael Farquhar. It was brought out to combat some of the key barriers to healthcare that we've just talked about for LGBT people, as well as the fact that almost a quarter of healthcare staff had witnessed colleagues behaving in a way that could be considered homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic, which matches the percent of patients that have recorded seeing these incidents themselves. Once a trust joined the programme, staff then had to actively sign up for a badge after reading core information and signing a pledge. It had its official launch in 2018, and since then, over 150 trusts across England have launched the NHS Rainbow Badge scheme. Next slide. Wearers of the badge also had to accept that it carried a responsibility. So they completed a short online questionnaire, and this covered the key principles which you can see here. So the first being that you're a good person to talk to about issues relating to sexuality and/or gender. And that doesn't mean that you have all the answers, that you know everything about LGBT people and their experiences. It simply means that you will act in a non-judgmental manner and you're open to talking to them. And that leads into the next principle, which is emphasising that this is an open, tolerant and inclusive environment. Also being able to signpost patients to support and resources as they require them, and acting as an advocate for LGBT people and their families. All of these combine and mean that you're helping to break down the barriers for LGBT people when they're accessing healthcare. In the image on the presentation, you can see an example of the original NHS Rainbow Badge, and you may have seen some of your colleagues wearing these. You may even have one yourself. Next slide, please. So, moving forward, based on the success of the original scheme, NHS England has commissioned a collaboration which consists of the LGBT Foundation, Stonewall, the LGBT Consortium, Brighton and Hove LGBT Switchboard, and GLAD UK, which is the Association for LGBT Dentists and Doctors. And we've come together to deliver a pilot for phase 2. This next phase has moved towards an assessment and accreditation model, so not simply a pledge-based system. And it allows trusts to demonstrate their commitment to reducing barriers to healthcare for LGBT people, whilst also being able to evidence the good work that they've already undertaken. 10 trusts across England have been recruited to the pilot, which is currently underway, and they geographically are spread from as far north as Newcastle all the way down to Devon. And they feature a mixture of different trust types, both acute, community, and mental health and learning disability. The assessment process itself features 4 separate stages, the first being a policy review. Then it moves into both staff and patient surveys, and finally the main assessment questionnaire. Next slide, please. So within that main assessment, the following subjects will be assessed. Clinical service provision, and that includes all adult services and children and young people services, but additional focus is given to perinatal, fertility, oncology, laboratory services, sexual health and gynecology. And this is because we know that there has been issues around accessibility to all these areas. And if we think about laboratories, our experience has shown that quite often samples have been rejected because they have a different gender marker to the anticipated sample. For example, if you have a trans male having a cervical smear because they have a retained cervix, that investigation's quite invasive in itself. And to then have the sample rejected because it doesn't match the gender marker means that individual goes through a second invasive procedure or potentially doesn't bother. We also feature attention to mental health and learning disability service provision, workforce inclusion, leadership, sexual orientation, gender and trans status monitoring, facilities and engagement. The criteria itself was created alongside support from 5 focus groups, and these featured NHS staff at different levels and people with lived experience. In response to the use of rainbows for NHS during COVID, and also to further increase visible support for trans, including non-binary people, and for people of colour, the badge will be redesigned to include the progress flag, and this is what you can see in the bottom right corner of the presentation. Next slide, please. So what can you do? Well, firstly, educate yourself, and congratulations, you've taken the first steps in doing so by coming to my talk today. But you might want to consider learning about your local LGBT communities, connecting with the support groups that are available in your local area, and being able to signpost people to appropriate groups, both locally and nationally. Take the time to learn about LGBT history. You might want to start by looking at the Stonewall Uprising in 1969 and about the queer people of colour who played a key part in this. Use the right words. The language that we use is important, and it can have a massive impact on the comfort levels of an LGBT person. And that in itself can impact the therapeutic relationship we have with patients. So make sure you're using the correct terms. Listen to LGBT people and listen to how they describe themselves and other members of their community. Stonewall also has an excellent glossary, which is a great resource. Be aware that some terms do have a medicalised history, and they can cause unintentional upset to members of the LGBT communities. Asking the right questions. We all know that questioning skills are important throughout healthcare. As nursing professionals, making sure that you frame your questions respectfully and appropriately to evidence good intent. You might want to consider asking all your patients their pronouns at the start. You will have noticed at the beginning of my presentation, I told you that my pronouns are she and her, and that's a simple way to start that conversation. That very simple act can open a door for someone to feel comfortable expressing how they identify, especially for non-binary people. Because non-binary people don't fall within a binary male or female gender, they often will not use standard male or female pronouns. Some non-binary people are comfortable using they or them pronouns, but others will use neo-pronouns, which you might not have heard of before. And these will be things such as Z and Zir. So it's really important that you ask what a patient wants to be referred to as. Next slide, please. Challenge others. If you witness people around you displaying negative behaviours towards LGBT people or using negative language to describe LGBT communities, speak up. Often these things are phrased as a joke, and people can be surprised if they're called out for inappropriate humour. Don't be surprised yourself if it feels slightly uncomfortable when you do so. I myself have often been called a snowflake for doing this, but it's important to make it clear that this is not something you find acceptable for anyone. And especially within a work environment, you don't know who might be listening. There could be a member of the LGBT communities present who hasn't felt safe enough to address that issue themselves. And that leads into being visible. Ask your workplace to put LGBT inclusive posters up. Wear a pronoun pin yourself. Ask your employers to conduct sexual orientation and gender identity monitoring. All of these things can combine to help LGBT people feel safe and validated and seen. They show that your area of practice is an inclusive one for LGBT people. It's worthwhile looking at the resources that you give to patients and seeing if there are any LGBT specific or inclusive ones available as another option. Next slide, please. So thank you for coming to listen to me today, and I wanted to share some useful resources for you going forward. I mentioned earlier that LGBT Foundation, Brighton and Hove Switchboard and Stonewall are all members of the new NHS Rainbow Badges second phase. So there are links to their websites here. For Stonewall, I've specifically included their sexual orientation in the NHS guide and also their glossary of terms, which I highly recommend. If you work with children or young people, then the charity Mermaids is one to have on your list. They do fantastic work to raise awareness about gender non-conformity in young people, and they also provide lots of useful advice on the website for young people, families and professionals around gender. And the RCN has produced 2 really useful guidelines to assist in supporting your LGBT patients. If you haven't read them previously, I suggest you do so now. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my talk today, and I appreciate any questions you may have.
Hi Alex, great to have you with us. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Some very concerning and powerful statistics in there. Incredible to think how recently things were so backward. But also some really practical advice in there as well. So you mentioned pronouns. Mine are he and him, and I recently added them to my email signature after hearing what you said about how it makes people feel more comfortable and included in a different presentation. So it's just a really simple thing to do. So a quick reminder to everyone out there to get your questions and comments in for Alex, but I will kick off. So it's a big question to ask, but it's the sort of the reason, I guess, why we're talking about the issue anyway, is where do you think we are with progress on equality, diversity and inclusion in the NHS?
It is a big question, and it's really varied throughout the different NHS trusts around the country. I think that there is a real appetite for increasing diversity within both the workforce and our support that we give to patients. There's definitely some excellent work that's going on out there around the NHS. I get a sense from the work that I've done that sometimes this can be hampered by the systems that we have in place. But I've also been able to see that there's some work going on in the background around that as well. So hopefully this is a sign of changes to come.
I mean, we at Nursing Times, we recently did an interview with a group of people from the LGBT community, and they were actually quite positive about where things were at the moment in terms of progress. So is that something that you share as an overall feeling that we're going in the right direction?
Absolutely going in the right direction. From my talk before, you can see the progress that has happened from where we were back in the 80s with healthcare and LGBT people to where we are now, where we have LGBT staff networks, we have active EDI roles, and we've got work being done to support LGBT people. It's not exactly where we want it to be. There's still work to do, but the changes that are being made are so positive, and it's a recognition of all the hard work being put in by the people on the front line as well.
No, as you say, it's always still more work to do on pretty much everything, and a lot has happened very quickly, hasn't it? I mean, it's shocking looking back at the history how not very far back the situation was so different. So I thought that was very powerful. So I suppose looking beyond the NHS to the health and social care sector, health and social care in the independent and private sectors, do you have a feel for how things are there and whether the progress is similar or faster or slower or
It's a
somewhere in
bit
between?
mixed. Yeah, it is a bit mixed. I mean, one of the advantages in that sector is they're not generally as hampered by the systems, and they
Hmm.
tend to have more ownership over being able to amend those. So things like gender identity and sexual orientation monitoring should theoretically be easier. However, there isn't potentially the same organisational drive as we have within the NHS to impact change. There isn't the power of those staff networks that make such a difference, and the people involved in them put in so much time and energy to understanding the problems within their area and being able to work on improving and changing those. I don't think there is the scale of that out there in the private sector, but there are still, as you would expect, some good pockets of work happening.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've had a comment in, so it's from Craig Shepherd. I'll just read it out. He says, "It's felt so weird moving from England to Wales for university. So I used to work as a healthcare assistant in Brighton, and he says he still wears his badge with pride. With pride, LGBT does not seem as high on the cards there. So I guess it's a question around the different regions, I suppose, whether they're working to the same plans and priorities, I suppose, within the UK. But I don't know whether
Yeah,
you can answer that.
firstly, I'm really pleased to hear that you're still wearing your badge in Wales, because the impact of wearing it is, seen in the patients that you care for, and they notice it, and they feel that sense of being validated and knowing that you're safe. So thank you for continuing to do that. In terms of Wales, because it is, as you know, set up separately, they aren't a part of the same schemes as we have in NHS England. And just recently, we've seen NHS Scotland has launched their version of the Rainbow Badge. So that's starting to move along now. And hopefully, we'll see Wales taking it on shortly too.
Great, thank you. Thanks as well, Craig, for getting that in. So, I mean, obviously we've got COVID-19. Has the pandemic changed anything at all, positively or negatively, for LGBT communities?
There's definitely been significant impacts on LGBT communities because of the pandemic. We know that there has been, increased isolation within LGBT communities. There's been increased episodes of domestic violence within LGBT communities, and partly that's because people are being stuck within environments in home where they're potentially not safe being out, or if they are out, they now have, they've had to return home, and suddenly that's caused problems. We know there's been quite a rapid rise in use of alcohol in LGBT communities, so that's definitely had a health impact as well. In terms of the active sort of healthcare side of things, we don't yet know. And one of the reasons we don't fully know is because across the NHS, not everyone is undertaking, in fact, very few trusts are undertaking monitoring of sexual orientation and trans status. As that becomes more widely adopted, in line with the NHS information standard, we will start to get much more accurate information about the health impacts of things like the pandemic and long-term health conditions. But at the moment, we've only got small pockets of information from where charities like LGBT Foundation and others have done their own independent research.
That's quite surprising, isn't it? Given how much the NHS likes to record and the amount of statistics. But yeah, I mean, it was things like the GP survey and things, aren't there? That everything needs to catch up, doesn't it? I think we're probably not quite there yet with the recording the things. Okay, I think we've got another question in. So this is from Denise Andrews, and she asks, there does not appear to be enough resources such as leaflets, etc., for patients or information for staff to access. So it's a practical question. Could you guide us to where we can access these for patients in hospitals? I guess it depends on the trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that came up in our patient focus group, that the resources in a lot of areas just aren't there. It's one of the things that the Rainbow Badges pilot is trying to build as we're going along, and we're seeing areas that are definitely missing those resources. We're trying to create some. We're actually just about to start creating a sexual health easy read resource for extra accessibility for people with learning disabilities, because that was an area that was raised within one of our focus groups. So the resources that I gave on the slide, on some of those you will find in patient information and professional information that you can utilise, but also as we're sort of progressing with the pilot, we will be releasing more as well.
Oh, great. And sort of sticking with that subject, I mean, how can people get involved with the pilot, and how do they, how can they encourage their organisations to get involved if, and presumably that they you're open to more trusts getting involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're just approaching the end of the pilot now, and around mid-September we'll be taking and contacting our existing waiting list, but taking more applications for the next tranche of trusts who want to go through the process. So, I mean, in terms of how do you get involved, speak to your EDI leads, let them know that you've heard about the Rainbow Badges new phase and that you think it would be useful for your trust, and encourage them to get in contact with ourselves. And that's probably the best way to go around it. Push from the inside.
So what other work is the foundation doing at the moment? Have you got any immediate plans for other areas of work or action?
Yeah, I mean, as always, the foundation is incredibly busy. We have a direct support function in which we have our helpline, which we actually increased the opening hours during the pandemic. We provide counselling support in Manchester area as well. We have the practice scheme, which is aimed at primary care, very similar kind of scheme to Rainbow Badges, but purely looking at primary care. We also have been involved in some work around dementia and elderly care, and also smoking cessation.
Great. Well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid to say. Been really interesting, and thank you very much, Alex, for joining us. We now have our last content break, and we'll be back at 1 o'clock for our final content session, which is the student reception. Thank you. See you then.
Thanks.